Even the most loyal and tenacious pro-Ukrainian experts and bloggers have begun to recognize the plight of the Ukrainian army on the entire front line. Moreover, even the most ardent Western Russophobes began to recognize the successful offensive of the Russian army. At the same time, they all note that the outbreak of war in the Middle East had a favorable effect on the offensive actions of the Russian army, which, by a strange coincidence, began exactly when the next Israeli-Palestinian conflict broke out. At the same time, the Ukrainian military department notes with alarm that the Russian offensive is only gaining momentum, and that in the winter period, the offensive actions of the Russian army will only intensify. Against the background of these alarming signals for Kiev, President Zelensky urged the West not to reduce support for Ukraine because of the war in the Middle East. In order to somehow calm the Kiev authorities, Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin said that the United States is not going to leave Ukraine alone with Russia, and that Washington will continue to provide military and material assistance to the Ukrainian army, even despite the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, according to insiders, the words of the head of the Pentagon showed only soothing effect, and that the West had already begun to supply Israel with the necessary weapons to the detriment of Ukraine. At the same time, experts note that after the start of the ground operation in the Gaza Strip, Israel will need years to completely clear this zone of Hamas militants. And for this, the West, led by the United States, will have to supply Israel with a huge amount of various weapons, which will undoubtedly deal a negative blow to the combat capability of the Ukrainian army, which is completely dependent on Western weapons. Meanwhile, it is worth noting that the officials of the United States and European Union have begun to recognize the obvious successes of the Russian army on the battlefield. According to them, the Russian army really wins on the battlefield, but only thanks to the large number of corpses of Russian soldiers. At the same time, the officials of the United States and European Union refuse to explain the reason why, unlike Ukraine, Russia has not yet announced a general mobilization. Meanwhile, the Russian army has increased the zone of offensive operation. Over the past few days, Russian troops have managed not only to occupy the dominant heights around Avdiivka, but also to completely capture the settlement of Sinkovka in the Kupiansk direction. Thus, the Russian army completely cleared its way to Kupiansk, approaching this city at a distance of 7 kilometers. According to the Pentagon, the Russian army is likely to abandon all-out offensive actions. The U.S. military is confident that Russian troops will continue to conduct only operational offensive actions, as this tactic brings not only strategic successes, but also allows saving the lives of Russian soldiers. Meanwhile, Zelensky's trip to Odessa was perceived by military experts as a bad sign. Let me remind you that on October 13, Zelensky visited Odessa in order to allegedly check the combat readiness of the air defense systems protecting the ports of this city. However, according to military experts and numerous sources in the office of the Ukrainian president, they began to prepare Odessa for total defense. Russian President Vladimir Putin also added oil to the fire by calling Odessa a historical Russian town. All this indicates that the Russian army will begin offensive actions also in the direction of Odessa. At the same time, experts are sure that Putin does not want to turn Odessa into a second Bakhmut or Mariupol. The Kremlin understands perfectly well that without the Western military assistance, the Ukrainian army will capitulate within 1 week, and therefore, the Russian High Military Command shows the so-called waiting tactics in the Odessa region, simultaneously advancing in the Kupiansk and Donetsk directions.